Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Laura Herman. I'm the Director of Program and Evaluation here at JPro. JPro is the organization that is of, by, and for all those who work at Jewish community organizations across the United States and Canada. As you're taking a moment to log in, please take a second to rename yourselves with your name and your organization and your pronouns if you would like, so that we can get to know everybody who's joining us today. Thanks so much for being here and being part of this program, a nonpartisan approach to engage Jewish communities in the upcoming election. Before we begin, a couple of quick notes. First, our session is being recorded and will be shared on our YouTube channel afterward. Closed captioning is also available, and you can access that through the controls at the bottom of your screen. Should you need anything throughout the program, my colleague Katie Hamelberg has renamed herself JPro Help, and you can feel free to chat her directly with any technical issues. Our program today will explore how we as professionals can support the democratic process while also serving constituents from various political and religious backgrounds. While I know that politics can be a somewhat polarizing issue, this is a nonpartisan program. As a participant, we ask that you refrain from name calling, speaking in generalizations, and promoting stereotypes aloud or in the chat. If you do not comply with these guidelines, you will be removed from our session. One of the things that we'll do during our time together is to think about what it means to be a citizen. I'd like to first take a moment to get us started and invite you to put into the chat what this means to you. Please share a formative experience, either your first one or a recent one that you had related to active citizenship. I'll give you a minute to think about it and put those answers into the chat. We'd just like to collect them as a way to help us start to think about what this means for all of us together. Our speakers today are going to address from their vantage point what they are doing to support civil society and democracy. We are so grateful to have Mike Berkowitz, co-founder of Third Plateau, Julia Lipton, program officer at the Howard and Geraldine Pollinger Family Foundation, and Aaron Dorfman, founder and executive director of A More Perfect Union, the Jewish Partnership for Democracy, in conversation with each other. My colleague Marissa will put their full bios into the chat so that you can learn more about them. Each will be starting to share for a few minutes about their perspectives on democracy and Jewish engagement, and we will then open the program to hear your questions. I'd like to now take a moment to pass it over to Mike, who will get us started.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Laura. I am gonna do a couple of things this morning. I'm on the West Coast, so I'll continue to count it as morning. I'm gonna scare you a little bit, and I'm gonna apologize in advance for doing that. But I do want to give you a sense of what I see as the sort of threat landscape for free and fair elections in the US right now. And then I'm going to end on a more uplifting note as we actually turn to what we can do about it. So let me first of all say that free and fair elections in the United States, and I am speaking about the US here and not Canada, they're under threat in ways that they never have been in the past. We, of course, in the US have a long and sordid history of voter suppression, and the Supreme Court's 2013 ruling gutting the Voting Rights Act has significantly exacerbated the problem. But as bad as that issue is, voter suppression is only one part of the threat that we're facing today. The threat to US elections now comes from a couple of different places and manners. First and foremost, it comes from political candidates who refuse and are refusing right now for this election cycle to accept the validity of elections that they might lose. It comes from the dramatic and persistent underfunding of election administration. It comes from people running to oversee elections with the explicit goal of helping their side win, rather than upholding the long tradition of nonpartisan election administration. It comes from the harassment, doxing, intimidation, and threats of violence against election workers and their families, which we're seeing throughout the country. And it comes from the mass retirements of so many of these elections professionals, up to about a third by some counts, who just can't take it anymore. Who, at best, up until this past election cycle, were sort of anonymous parts of the process, and now just for doing their jobs are being threatened, and having their families being threatened. It comes from partisans encouraging poll workers to break the rules and to act as spies for their partisan sides. It comes from state legislators willing to overturn the will of the people in their states, and from a Supreme Court that might actually next term provide such a move constitutional legitimacy. And finally, it comes from rampant misinformation, disinformation, and downright conspiracy theories, some of them mixed up with traditional anti-Semitic tropes that fuel doubt about the legitimacy of our election system. And I'm not going to lie, as I sort of noted a moment ago, this is a really, really difficult set of circumstances to face and to overcome. There are a lot of parts of the system, places that the system can break down and can be challenged in really problematic ways. And if you have wondered whether American democracy might actually be teetering on the brink or whether that's overblown, if you've wondered whether the risk to free and fair elections in the US is real, I'm here to say it is. It really, really is. But as odd as it may seem for a group of Jewish communal professionals to be talking about how to help uphold the American electoral system, I truly believe that it's civil society, as one of the most independent sectors in American life, one of the most robust, probably the most robust non-business, non-governmental sector anywhere in the world, anywhere in history. It's civil society in the US that gives us the chance to overcome this threat. And because now you know about it, and now you can begin considering what to do with the various resources at your disposal, you have a chance to actually make a difference on this. So Aaron will likely get into more detail when he talks about some of the ways that a more perfect union is advising Jewish communal institutions to get involved. But I'm going to close with just 3 broad thoughts in this regard. The first is that there are a number of roles, from poll workers to poll watchers to election administrators, and we can disentangle what those different roles are in the conversation, where we need people from all political stripes and backgrounds who are willing to uphold free and fair elections to get involved. The second is that we need to make others aware of this threat so that they can act. But we need to do so in ways where we're really clear that defending free and fair elections is not a partisan issue. It cannot take place only on one side of the political spectrum or the other. And it's not about getting our preferred side to win elections. The other thing that we have to be careful about when we talk about this, and I probably didn't do a great job of it thus far, but I'm trying to redeem myself, is we have to be careful not to create a sense of fatalism that can lead to disengagement. The whole point of making people aware of the threat is actually to mobilize them to action. And the psychology on this is really complicated. And the third thing I want to say is that everything we talk about today can apply to you personally just as easily as it can to the rest of your staff, your board, your volunteers, your donors, and your other stakeholders. So see this as an opportunity for you to think about your own institutions, but also your own personal engagement. And the reason that I want to say that I think faith communities in particular within civil society have such an important role to play in this moment is first and foremost because we are already organized, especially here in the Jewish community, into a vast network of institutions that can act when mobilized. But the other piece that, of course, matters here that I want to sort of pair with the institutional is that we can act and speak with the kind of moral purpose and conviction that motivates others to do the right thing. And I think that's really especially key in this moment. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to turn the floor over to Julia to talk about what the Pollinger Foundation is doing and thinking in this regard. Aaron will then talk about a more perfect union, and we'll open up for discussion.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you all for being here today. It's so wonderful to get a chance to be with you and to talk about a topic that's so timely and important. So as Mike said, I'm going to follow on his presentation and provide an example of one group and what we're doing, and speak to why it's important for our foundation, the Pollinger Family Foundation, to support Jewish community work on democracy. And in starting to think about that, I think it's going to be helpful to go back and explain a little bit about who we are and then how we got here. So who we are a family foundation that was started in 1968. A core component of our work since our inception has been supporting and strengthening Jewish communities and culture. And one of our grant-making areas is fostering and building Jewish identity and strengthening Jewish life in emerging communities. A key component of that work is combating anti-Semitism and ensuring justice and fair treatment for Jewish communities. In addition to supporting Jewish communities and culture, we also support a fair number of secular projects. The core tenet of the secular work is to improve the quality of life for families and their communities. All of our work, both secular and Jewish, is guided by some Jewish concepts, including Tikkun Olam, the belief in repairing the world, and the obligation that we all share to defend the defenseless. So at the base of our foundation's work is a desire to improve the quality of life for families and their communities. So now that you know a little bit about who we are, I can explain why, when, how we started focusing on these democracy issues. Our interest really began in 2016. I know that was pretty close in everybody's memory, so I think we can all remember the 2016 elections brought issues of democracy to the forefront of the public's attention. And the board was extremely concerned about the deterioration in civility that they were seeing during that election. In addition, they saw a connection between the decrease in civility and the decrease in the belief in democracy and the rise in anti-Semitism. They also saw many similarities between the misinformation that was being spread in the US and the rise of the Nazi Party in pre-World War II Germany. So all these concerns seemed well aligned with the foundation's focus areas and values, and the board wanted to learn more and see if there was something that we could keep aligned with our vision and mission and still support this issue. They felt like at the core of what we were seeing were families and communities being hurt and a deterioration in the quality of life for families and their communities. So again, that just felt really well aligned. The other piece that felt like needed to be addressed was there was a specific connection to the Jewish background. The Jewish community has traditionally been the canary in the coal mine for many marginalized communities. And if one marginalized community is at risk, then all marginalized communities are at risk. And in addition, the US seemed to be at a tipping point with an increased attack on these marginalized communities. So knowing that we wanted to focus on it, our first step was to proceed carefully, right? We didn't want to do any harm. We really wanted to help. So we did a lot of research to determine what the issue really was and the best ways to fix the problems. We talked to many experts in the field and worked on educating ourselves and the board. We're still doing this because the field is constantly changing. So reaching out to Mike, reaching out to Aaron are things that we love to do. But through the research, we learned that one issue creating the injustices we were seeing is that marginalized communities were losing access to the democratic process. Civics education isn't required to be taught in many places. Voting laws are making it harder to vote. Gerrymandering is preventing anybody who does vote from counting. And we felt like while the Jewish community is at the same level of risk as any other community from experiencing these strategies that I just mentioned were having an even greater impact on traditionally marginalized communities. Through talking with experts like Eric Ward from the Western State Center and leaders at ADL, we started to realize that there really is a connection between the deterioration of democracy and the rise of anti-Semitism. A lot of these experts taught us that anti-Semitism is part of a bigger picture of growing hate. Eric Ward has written many articles describing how anti-Semitism is at the base of white nationalism and linking anti-Semitism to other forms of bias. So for this reason, we felt like it wasn't effective to combat anti-Semitism in a vacuum. and different forms of bias feed each other. So if you don't address the root of the problem, it won't go away. I kind of describe it like a fire with all the different flames, and you can blow really hard on this one flame, but if all the other flames are still burning, this is going to ignite again. And so you really need to address the root. So while fighting anti-Semitism and strengthening Jewish communities remains a primary concern for the foundation, we felt like, from what we've learned, the best way to address this was to ensure democracy for all. So for this reason, much of the work that we do protecting democracy has been working to ensure that all voices are heard in the democratic process, and that those who are most marginalized and who are farthest from the process have access to voting and representation. And again, we feel like this work is well aligned with the foundation's ethos and values. As Jewish people from the foundation, we've had a firsthand seat in what it means to be marginalized and have our voices silenced. And at the same time, we have a capacity and privilege that we can put to use to support not only ourselves, but others who might not have the same capacity and privilege. So after doing all this initial research, we started funding. Our initial funding focused on education at the K through 12 level. And through this research, we learned that for every $50 spent on STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math, only 5 cents is spent on civic education. As a former science teacher, I wholeheartedly support spending that money on STEM education, but civics education needs to be included in that. So we really focused our attention on that. As many of you know, education is slow work, and the board wanted to also focus further down the pipeline and reach people of voting age. So our portfolio now focuses on both early education and ensuring voting access for all. So a long way of explaining why it's important for us at the Pollinger Family Foundation to support Jewish community work in a democracy. It really combines all of our focusing areas, or all of our focus areas. Ensuring democracy helps create a better society for all and reduces issues of anti-Semitism and incivility. One of the most attractive pieces for us about A More Perfect Union is that it fits in a unique sweet spot. It's working to ensure democracy for all by leveraging Jewish capabilities that we're privileged to have and in service of others. So the work couldn't be better aligned with our foundation's mission. So having heard who we are and what we're doing, I'm going to actually pass it off to Aaron, and he's going to talk about what a little bit more about A Perfect Union and what they're doing to ensure fair, free, and safe and accessible 2022 midterm election.
Julia, thanks so much. And thanks to the Pollinger Foundation for supporting us, and to Mike for being one of our strategic advisors, and to both of you for being here as part of this conversation. And gratitude to JPro for hosting us. It feels very timely. Certainly my blood pressure shot up during Mike's presentation, as it does every time I hear Mike speak. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to share that with trusted colleagues. A More Perfect Union is a relatively new undertaking. We launched earlier in 2022 as a spin-off from work that I'd been privileged to work on when I was leading Lipton Cantor Foundation for Living Torah. So it's got a kind of some momentum behind it, but it's a startup. And I'd say, and I think this builds on the things that Mike and Julia both said, its founding premise is that Jews in America have it better than we've had it anywhere else in the diaspora in the last 2,000 years. And that's not something we can take for granted. We have built something kind of amazingly thriving here. Jewish schools and synagogues and camps and self-help agencies and advocacy organizations and nonprofits of all kind of stripes and shapes and colors. And our hypothesis is that that's primarily our ability to do that, our ability to create the vibrant Jewish life we've created in this country is primarily a function of American democracy. The rule of law, freedom of association, protection for religious minorities, all those things have made possible what we've built, and have created a container in which everyone from Agudath Israel to Jewish Voice for Peace can find a place. And all of the things we tangle with each other about and argue about in terms of Jewish life and Jewish expression live inside of that container. And as history has shown us, and certainly the last 10 or 15 years globally have reminded us, democracies don't take care of themselves. And when democracies decline, Jews are among the first to take it on the chin. So there ought to be a way for us as a Jewish community, a small but relatively influential community, if only out of enlightened self-interest, to find ways to work together across our denominational and ideological and political divides to ensure that the container survives, both for ourselves and for the people with whom we share this country. So we launched with that as our premise, and then we asked ourselves the question, what does American democracy need most at this moment, and where can the Jewish community make meaningful contributions? And we came out of that process with two primary answers. The first, which is the focus of this conversation, is we need free and fair elections. Elections are not the sum total of democracy, but they're an essential ingredient. It's essential but not sufficient. And the second thing we need, which is the subject of a lot of research for us this year, is we need strong democratic culture, right? We need a good civics education that Julia and Mike have both alluded to. We need a healthy information ecosystem. We need a commitment to pluralism that allows us to disagree with each other without hating each other or wanting to kill each other. Those are all components of a healthy democracy that are at least as important as free and fair elections. We're trying to figure out exactly what the Jewish community's entry point is on those things, and we'll be rolling out work on that in 2023. But because it's a midterm election year, because there is concrete work to do, because of all of the warning flags that Mike alluded to in his presentation, maybe not alluded to, spelled out in stark and terrifying detail, we felt like it was really important to concentrate on the midterms this year. So once we'd established that as a set of priorities, we worked with our group of strategic advisors, people like Mike, who are experts in the democracy space, experts in Jewish community life, very intentionally politically diverse, from the quite conservative right to the quite progressive left. And we worked with them over the course of the spring to try to identify concrete things that citizens and civil society organizations can do to protect elections, not the things that Congress needs to do or the courts or state legislatures, but the things that individual humans and particularly 501c3 nonprofits can do. And then we filtered that list through the question of where the Jewish community has comparative advantage, like what are we well positioned to do? And we came out of that process with 5 very concrete things that speak to some of the challenges that Mike described. The first is recruiting poll workers. It takes about 1 million people to run a federal election in this country every 2 years. And 30% of the people who worked the polls in 2020 said they don't want to come back, either because of the pandemic or because of the Stop the Steal movement. Whatever it is, they're bailing. And so the community's in the process of recruiting somewhere between 250 and 300,000 new poll workers this year. The second is recruiting nonpartisan poll monitors. These are the folks who hang out outside the polls, make sure that campaigns aren't electioneering, voters know where to go, voters aren't being intimidated, and so on. The third is recruiting lawyers to be part of a new bipartisan network called the Election Official Legal Defense Network that is providing pro bono legal support for election officials who may be targeted by frivolous lawsuits, who might be doxxed, whose families might be threatened. These are things that are happening at increasing rates in really unnerving ways. The fourth is we're working to open new polling sites around the country in places where they're needed. 70% of college campuses in America don't have a polling site on campus. The city of Chicago had to close 73 voting precincts during the Illinois state elections this year because they didn't have the physical infrastructure to house those polling sites. So we're working with Jewish institutions that have physical infrastructure in places where polling sites might be needed. And the last focus is on recruiting local Jewish community leaders, particularly clergy, to partner with other faith leaders in their communities and build relationships with their local election officials, their county clerks, their election administrators, have meetings with them before the election, attend the logic and accuracy tests that those administrators perform on the polling machines before the election, attend election board hearings as a show of support. And we're asking people to do this as a way of conveying to the election administration community that the faith community supports free and fair elections and is committed to them, supports them in the face of the Stop the Steal movement and other efforts to sort of discredit elections in this country. And finally, to be in a position after the election, if those election officials are accused of fraud, to be in a position to testify to their integrity. So we came up with these five strategies, and what we've been doing over the last several months is reaching out to Jewish community institutions across the country, big national organizations like Hillel International and Repair the World and the Movements, local institutions like synagogues and JCCs and independent nonprofits and Jewish Family and Children's Services, and inviting them to make public commitments to meet these needs. As of last week, we had 81 partner organizations around the country representing all 4 movements, lots of different sectors, I think 14 or 15 different states around the country, who had sort of stepped up and said, yeah, we're gonna put some resources and time and energy into doing this. Some of those commitments are quite ambitious. Hillel has committed to recruiting 150 poll workers and 150 poll monitors and placing polling sites on 5 college campuses. And Natan, the Giving Circle here in New York City, has committed to having 50% of its staff serve as poll monitors. It has a staff of 2, so one of them is going to be a poll monitor, but it is exactly the kind of commitment that it's able to make, that Natan is able to make, and meets a really urgent need. So we're here, we're taking advantage of this opportunity to share this with the JPro network in the hopes that some of you will be in positions to advocate for having your nonprofit organizations participate in this program. We'll share some more information in the chat. We'll share a link to our toolkit and other ways that you can be involved. And I guess I'll close, and then we can shift into conversation, which I'm hoping I'd be surprised if it isn't robust. Good questions. That our agenda as a More Perfect Union is really twofold in bringing in these commitment partners. The first is obviously to make a dent in the needs that the 2022 midterm elections have, right? The things that Mike described and outlined. But there's a second, and I think equally important priority for us, which is to build a network of cross-denominational, cross-ideological, cross-political Jewish organizations who share an explicit commitment to democracy, and build that network in a way that will endure beyond the 2022 election and be the foundation upon which we build the work we're going to do on democratic culture and future work on democracy, because we need this experiment to survive, and it's not going to make it without us, along with lots of other people. So I'll stop there and hand it back to Laura.
Thank you so much, Aaron. And thank you, Julia and Mike, for setting the stage for us. You brought up some really important and interesting things for us to think about. I want to now transition us to questions that all of you may have about the remarks that Julia, Aaron, and Mike shared. Feel free to put your questions in the chat for everyone, or to message me directly if you would prefer, and I can help moderate the conversation. I do also want to just sort of highlight the guidelines that we set out at the beginning of the program. So please refrain from name calling and speaking in generalizations during this part of the program. And our speakers have been asked to share the way that they're supporting the community in this work, and also to be respectful of diversity as they do so. I guess I'll start with one question that came up for me, for all of you actually, but particularly for Julia and Mike, as you were speaking. I'm wondering about some of the bright spots that you're seeing in this work. And Mike, you alluded to this both in terms of some of the fatalism that you mentioned, and also the fact that it's so important from a psychological perspective that we don't get sort of bogged down with those challenges. So I'm wondering, as questions come in, if we can start maybe with speaking of some of the bright spots that you're seeing as you're engaging in this work.
Julia, do you want me to start?
Go for it, Mike.
So, there's a couple of things, and it goes a little bit, I guess, to the question around get out the vote, although it's not directly on that, which is there's a whole host of activities that have been developed over the last couple of years to really help mobilize people to vote and participate in democracy, that have mobilized voter education, because obviously registering to vote is just the first step, but then we have all these things, people and ballot measures on the ballot. And if we're going to be informed citizens in a democracy, then we need to be able to educate people about those things. We also need to be able to educate people about where to vote, about what the latest rules and regulations are. Obviously, 2020 was a bit disorienting in that manner because those things were changing all the time. And then, to Erin's point around poll workers and election officials, there are all sorts of things that have been developed both to recruit poll workers and to celebrate election officials. So just to say really briefly, tomorrow is National Voter Registration Day. It is the Democracy Field's coordinated day on which lots of organizations, and if you are not one of them, you may still be able to sign up on their website or just use some of the materials in their toolkits. And if not this year, 2023, 2024 and beyond. But it's a sort of coordinated day to really do a final push for voter registration for the fall. November 7th is Election Hero Day, which is again an organized opportunity to celebrate and thank our election officials in the ways that Erin described. And then I'm forgetting the exact week, but I'll look it up. There's a Voter Education Week, which is an opportunity to do some of what I was alluding to earlier in terms of really helping folks understand what's going to be on the ballot and how to exercise their franchise. These are bright spots. They're really good. It's amazing to see the field getting organized in this way. And I think, to the fundamental part of your question, Laura, like we need the bright spots as part of a mix of strategies here. Again, it's a lot harder to figure out necessarily how those things I think do a lot in terms of participation. Participation is one part of what we need, but some of the other areas I think are also a lot more challenging, to figure out how to combat.
So I'm not the expert that Mike is in the broader picture, but I can tell you from our philanthropy side, those bright spots are so important. I know that our board at times starts to feel fatigue when we keep coming back to them saying, and here's another problem, and here's another problem, and here's another problem. They start to look at us like, well, why do this? Like there's just problem after problem, and are we really having any impact? So we've made a conscious effort to start highlighting some of those bright spots because they do exist. I think from my perspective, it's been really interesting to see the field grow. When we started this work in 2016, 2017, when I'd go out to organizations in the field doing this work and I'd say, hey, we're really interested in making an impact. What are you doing? A lot of the answer was, well, we're doing the same thing we've always done. We're trying to register voters. And it has seemed like in the past, 6 years, that answer has really changed. And it's changed to actually, we tried this new strategy, we're doing something new, we're looking at the data and we're trying to reach these voters who might not otherwise vote. Here's something we've tried in this specific one little state or one little district, and we're going to try and figure out how we can make it a more national approach. So people are feeling energized to try new strategies, and they're not just sitting back and saying, oh, we're registering people to vote. We're doing the same thing we've always done. So that's been a really big shift, and it's been great to see. It's also nice when we talk to a lot of the experts these days, we really do ask them to say, what are the bright spots you're seeing? What are the successes you're seeing? And when you ask that question, you get some really interesting answers and things that you'd never think about. We had the executive director from League of Women Voters come to speak to our board, and she actually had this whole list of, yes, here are some really great advancements we have made. And not to say that she wasn't just as dire and scary as hearing Mike talk. She had all those pieces as well, but she was pointing out that what we are doing is working, and we can't stop. But we do need to keep going, and we need to keep trying new things to see what's going to stick.
Laura, can I chime in?
Of course, please.
Great. So look, I love everything that Mike and Julia said, and I think like it's important from my vantage point to like think about the arc of this thing, right? Freedom House tracks the health of democracy globally, and democracy was like a winning proposition for a long time, like 60 consecutive years of democratic growth around the world, and it plateaued in 2008, and it's been in decline for 14 years. So like that's not a cause for hope. But what is kind of a remarkable reaction is that an enormous amount of energy and organizational power and people power has emerged to kind of respond to that, right? During those 14 years, Protect Democracy was founded. The Voting Rights Lab was founded. New Pluralists, which announced a project at the White House last week to put $1 billion against civil discourse and like fostering healthy dialogue between people. Those are resources and mobilizations, efforts like Civic Spirit in the Jewish community and interfaith communities to do civics education in parochial schools. One America movement to try to decrease toxic polarization in the evangelical community and other faith communities. There's a lot of amazing response happening to that global decline in democracies. It's going to take us at least as long to dig our way out, right? So, we're talking about the next 8 weeks, but a More Perfect Union's time horizon is 2040. So we're in this for the long haul, and I think that there's plenty to do, but there's a lot of people standing arm in arm and bringing resources to bear to do it.
Thanks for sharing that, Aaron. There's actually been a couple of questions that have come up about the specific strategies that are being used to bring people of difference together, both political difference and in terms of diversity in terms of age or race. Aaron, I don't know if you or Mike or Julia can speak to that issue as well.
Did we see those questions in the, have they come directly?
They came to me privately.
Got it.
Yes.
So in the like constructive disagreement, pluralism, civil discourse space, there has really been an explosion of, I mean that in a militaristic sense, that's the wrong word, but in a flourishing of different efforts to try to deal with those things. And I can just rattle off some of the organizations that are doing that work, I think in really amazing ways. Braver Angels is doing it with cross groups, with cross-partisan groups. Resetting the Table has been added in the Jewish community, initially around people with divergent perspectives on Israel, but after the 2016 election started doing work with immediately after 2016 with Clinton voters and Trump voters. One America movement I already mentioned is doing this. New Pluralists, which I mentioned a minute ago, is a new funder collaborative about 18 months old that ran a significant RFP to foster, to kind of incentivize organizations doing dialogue work in local communities over the summer. They put $10 million on the table, and I just heard that they got 800 proposals. Now, like, it's an amazing, 800 proposals is amazing. That means there's a lot of interest in it. It's also like, $10 million has some distorting effect to it, but the fact that there are those kinds of efforts out there, I feel like is reassuring.
there were also some questions about get out the vote efforts and, including people in democracy in that way on either a policy level or just sort of asking people to engage more broadly. Can you talk to that point a little bit?
I'll just say really quickly, most get out the vote efforts are actually partisan. So I think I'm gonna adhere to the rules of the road here and sort of not highlight, but there's lots of things that folks are probably aware of from 2020. Certainly, I'll just say as a general and nonpartisan matter, I think we have a much greater sense that efforts that use sort of social networks. There was a group in 2020, they changed their name and I can't remember what it's called now, but it was called Vote Tripling, which again, I think was partisan, but it's the methodology of, people actually reaching out to others that they know. That sort of social pressure, I think has been found to be quite effective.
Single best predictor of whether you'll vote if your friends and family vote and you know it.
Just to make one obvious point, and it goes, I think, a bit to Julia's point earlier that, so many folks in the democracy space used to see voting as kind of the end all be all of democracy. And I think what we have learned a lot, even though, we're talking about elections in a manner here, and of course, everything that I shared earlier is in this vein as well. But I think if we learned anything over the last 6 years, it's that democracy is actually about a lot more than voting. We have had record high voter participation in recent elections, and democracy is more threatened today than it was, 2, 4, 6 years ago, for all the reasons that I articulated at the top of the meeting. And so it's a critical part, our ability to vote for whom we want and have that vote counted, and have the winner of the election actually installed in office. I mean, that is the centerpiece, of course, of democracy, but it's not the only piece. And so I think, Julia's comment about all of the experimentation going on in philanthropy, I think is true across civil society. And I think it's really for that very reason.
To piggyback a little bit on what Mike was saying, some of the stuff that we are seeing and that we're learning, that we had to educate ourselves on and our board on, is that making a donation 8 weeks before the elections is not helpful. And that all of these organizations doing this work, as Aaron's talking about, yes, we're concerned about the midterms, but we're concerned about what happens after, and we're concerned about long-term, what does a democracy look like? And so this feast and famine voting style is not helpful to anybody. And it really is the long-term continuous funding so that organizations can not only get people to come and vote, but can be involved in their politics afterwards, can make sure that the people that they elected are addressing their concerns and are representing them in the policies that they're making, and that the constituents understand what policies would be helpful and what the policies mean. They're not just some flowery language that, oh yeah, I like that word a lot, and that aligns with me. What does it really mean? What am I voting for? And what should I expect from my representatives after they're elected? And how do I ensure that they are still providing me what I need? That's all part of a democracy. And in order to do that, these organizations need long-term funding to maintain those relationships, to maintain that education, and to maintain that work that is really started at the election, but continues all the way along. And it turns into a cyclical cycle then, right? Because once you have the people involved and they're active in their communities, getting them to vote the next time around is a lot easier. It's not perfect, but it's a lot easier because you have an active citizen. And what we want to make a democracy work is we want active citizens who participate in the process.
Sorry, Aaron, go ahead.
I was just gonna pick up on Jamie's question in the chat.
As was I. Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, wonderful. So This is a really tricky question, Jamie. And so I appreciate you coming back to it. So, the first thing is that you see everyone struggling with this. This is point number one. There are a couple of pieces in the New York Times today, I think, about this challenge. There is a need to educate and inform. And when you have a threat that people don't take seriously, or aren't aware of, there is a need to talk about it. But we also have seen very clearly that fails to actually motivate people to do what is needed in that regard. And it can be quite demobilizing, especially if we talk about it in a fatalistic manner. And so just to say point number one, there's a tension here that maybe is somewhat irresolvable, but I think calls us to both talk about it, but to maybe even much better than I did at the start of the call, to balance a sense of the challenge with our ability to actually do something about it. Point two is that all of the messaging that I have seen that is effective in this regard places, and this is one reason I still actually come back to talking about our role as voters, as poll workers, the importance of lawyers who have those skills standing up to help election officials and elections more broadly in the ways that Aaron described. All of the messaging that I've seen be successful centers voters. It says that we, the people, get to decide. We decide who our elected officials are. Elected officials don't get to choose. So when you hear efforts to combat gerrymandering, that's one of the messages, right? You don't get to choose your voters. The voters get to choose, we get to choose our elected officials. The same is going to be true if we see state legislatures, which is a threat in 2024, decide to throw out the winner of the popular vote in their states and choose for themselves who gets awarded their electors. That is, right, same kind of dynamic, the same messaging. We, the people, get to decide. You don't get to decide. Third thing that I'll just say as a sort of overall matter, this is something that the democracy space broadly is waking up to. We have become really good at talking about the threat. We have become really good at trying to combat it. We don't have as much of a track record of actually painting a picture for people of what it is we're fighting for, why democracy matters, where we're going with this. In some ways that's tough because democracy, when we really get to it as a nonpartisan matter, is a bit procedural, right? It's not about the outcomes, it's about how you get to the outcomes. Nonetheless, we have to do a better job of painting a positive vision alongside the work that we're doing to combat the threats. And there's some work that my team at the Democracy Funders Network and Third Plateau is doing on this right now. We're going to launch a report in the next couple of weeks called the Better Futures Project, where we're really looking at all of the work out in the field, in the democracy space and beyond, to actually paint a positive vision for the future. We want to connect that to the democracy work much more explicitly, because I think it's needed to reach the public. It's needed so that we don't have a sense of fatalism about our work. And it's needed so we can actually develop strategies to achieve those kinds of goals.
Aaron or Julia, do you have anything to add to comment on this question?
I'll just throw in a couple of other quick observations. One, I think in addition to the procedural challenge, like, when democracy has worked well, it's kind of been invisible, right? Like I never heard, like, the peaceful transfer of power I heard about in like 9th grade civics class in Arden Hills, Minnesota, and then never occurred to me to be a thing until 2016, when suddenly that was a questioned thing. So I think we've gotten used to it being in the background, and that's Sandra Day O'Connor talked about how you've got to like reinvent as a society your commitment to democracy every generation, because it doesn't, it's not self-sustaining. It requires the work of active citizenship in order to pull it off. So I think that's a piece of it. I also think the fact that like our democracy has there's no like old perfect version of our democracy that we can look back to and be like, oh, we just need to get back to that one, because like it's never been It's never been perfect. It's been a process. It's been a process of getting better, of expanding the franchise, of ensuring voting rights, of making sure that all of the people can play a role in selecting their leaders, and that's a project. It reminds me a little bit of Judaism, something that like needs ongoing work in order to like fulfill its potential. But then I think the last thing I'll say is that part of the reason that we've at A More Perfect Union have chosen like uber concrete actions is because we found that the sort of deliberative bemoaning of all the things that are going wrong forms its own kind of paralysis. And getting into the mix, even to do something as like grueling as being a poll worker, or like as logistically complicated as setting up your JCC as a polling site, like these are not easy things. A poll worker works a 15-hour, 18-hour day on election day. That's hard, and they make $20 an hour. So it's not like not a get rich quick scheme, but it's like you're in the mix, right? You're in the arena, and that's part of how we, I think, build forward momentum. And double click on Brooke's point.
I don't think I can add much to what Aaron and Mike said, because they definitely have the bigger global picture. I can say that paralysis is something that we've dealt with internally, with going through this process and learning through the education. And we've had to be intentional about finding those bright spots, because they do exist, and there are strategies that are working, and they might not reach the goal they initially set out to reach, but they have made a change. And I think it's important whenever you're doing anything to stop and take a moment to reflect and say, okay, there are some things going well. There is a lot more work we need to do. But we have made some strides. And so I think just recognizing some of those steps has helped with our paralysis of, we don't want to do this anymore. We've been working hard. It hasn't made a difference. What does it matter?
Before we sort of take the time to conclude our program, I want to ask one last question about kind of some of the structural challenges that may exist in the American democratic process. Examples of this could be the two-party system, or the winner takes all, or first past the post kind of voting systems. Are there any mechanisms that you know, or sort of in the long term anticipate in terms of thinking about those within the challenges of the democratic process?
Yeah. I feel like this is more Mike's bailiwick than mine, but I'll just throw out a few that I like have been percolating around in my thinking. Like, we've got pretty robust data now that ranked choice voting moderates election outcomes. So there are experiments going on around ranked choice voting in general elections around the country. They have a moderating influence. I think that if they were adopted at the primary level, internal to parties, that would be a huge move in that direction if there were open primaries. I think that's a positive thing. I mean, I'll also just say Congress, the House of Representatives, when it was founded, each congressional representative represented 30,000 Americans. They now each represent somewhere between 800 and 900,000. Because Congress, in its infinite wisdom, froze the size of the House of Representatives in the 1920s after like incrementally increasing it year over year for a century and a half. And I think like fixing that would go a long way. Expanding the House of Representatives would go a long way toward further democratizing access and representation. But there are a lot of things like this. Mike, I'll turn it over to you because I know this is an area of deep study for you.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's, as Aaron said, there's a lot of reforms out there that folks are experimenting with, some of them like changing the size of the House or creating proportional representation within the House of Representatives, requires congressional action, which, feels tough in some regards, but also could be quite impactful. The experiments that we're seeing both around ranked choice voting and then ranked choice voting combined with open primaries in what's called a final 5 or final 4 voting. Final 4 is what we have seen now in Alaska. It was approved by Alaska voters in 2020 and then implemented in the Senate primary and in the special election for the House that just occurred there. There's a ballot measure in Nevada this year that will also be, I think, final 5. So we're seeing a lot of experimentation at the sort of state and local level around these experiments, and then lots of ideas about what could be done more broadly. I would refer you to a report called Our Common Purpose, which actually doesn't just talk about reforms, but does include a section on reforms. And one of the things that's really, or 2 things that are really important to note about this report: one, it was generated by a commission of Democrats and Republicans, conservatives, independents, progressives. And so there's ideological agreement, at least to a certain extent, on these sets of ideas. And the second is to note that what they're aiming for, and this was not a report that was just sort of put out into the world, it's created through the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, but it wasn't just put out into the world, you know, with some hope that people will do anything with it. They're actually working with implementing partners to try to move all of these ideas forward. And they're doing it with the goal of 2026 as the 250th anniversary of the founding of American democracy. And so anyway, there's lots of good things to look at in there. You know, I think we need structural reform. It's clear that the incentives in our system are pretty broken in a whole bunch of ways. That's in terms of both how we elect people, but also just how they see the responsibility of representation once they're in office. And, you know, I don't know which reforms are the best over others. We're still, I think, actually in the phase of we need to try a lot of things. We're going to try them in different contexts and we'll see what works. But there is a very robust reform community out there that has quite a lot of support from across the political spectrum.
Thank you. Julia, I know you sit in a little bit of a different place, but I just want to invite you if you have anything to add to this.
So I was going to say, I sit in a different place, and this is not my bailiwick. So I definitely defer to Mike and Aaron in that. I think the different perspective I would bring is the long-term approach of one of our big focus areas has been education. And as I said earlier, there is no money going into civic education. And these are the people who are going to become our future voters, who are going to become our future representatives. And I think it's essential that we all understand how a democracy works, the good and the bad, so that when we go and start talking about, you know, ranked choice voting and different representation, we have an understanding of what that means. For a lot of adults, let alone kids, you start talking about this stuff and they go, how many branches of government do we have? What are we talking about? Right. And so I think that education piece is going to be important to support all of those other efforts that Aaron and Mike are talking about that are so valuable.
Thank you. I know that we are getting close to our time here, so I want to first thank Aaron, Mike, and Julia for sharing with us over the course of this hour. Your comments have been both thought-provoking and interesting, give us reason to pause to really examine what we're doing ourselves. So I appreciate you raising all of these points and sharing your time with us today. As we conclude, I would also like to ask all of you to put in the chat, what is one thing that you're leaving with that's motivating you right now to engage either individually or communally in democracy moving forward? I'll give you a second to put those in. And my colleague Katie will also put a short evaluation into the chat. We take your feedback very seriously at JPro, so if you want to take a minute to fill that out as well, that would be great. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We hope that you'll be able to join us for another JPro program soon, and you can check out all of our upcoming programs and master classes on our website. I really appreciate all of you taking this hour of your time to spend with us to really think together about this important topic of how we can address some of the challenges that are happening throughout the democratic process. And I know that we will follow up with Erin's website to make sure that you know about how you can engage in the upcoming election. And we look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you so much.